I'm so happy to have you here. This is Ben Hookway, who is the CEO of Relative Insights, which is a company that do language analyses based on natural language processing and machine learning to do lots of different kinds of things that would be impossible by a human alone. So welcome, Ben, today. I'm so pleased you're here.
Thanks very much for inviting me along. Glad to be here.
You're very welcome. Perhaps you could tell me a little bit about yourself before we get into the solution.
Yeah, sure. So, as you said, I'm the CEO of Relative Insight. I've been doing sort of a deep technology businesses all of my career. So, Relative Insight, though, is easily the most exciting one that I've ever worked on. But yeah, I'm a career technologist, bringing cool stuff to market and growing those businesses.
Sounds great. And could you tell me a little known unusual fact about yourself?
That I can repeat. Yeah, probably that if I'm not thinking about language analytics, I'd be off windsurfing at any point. I'm a really, really big windsurfer. That's what I love to do in my spare time when I get it.
Yeah, but you don't get much. Now, think about what I would like to ask you next is, how did Relative Insight come into being?
Sure. Okay. So, I mean, what Relative Insight does is it's a language analytics, text analytics platform, which we sell to agencies and brands directly. I suppose our ethos is that there's so much language data sloshing around the world online. Okay, so most companies have language data that they just really hadn't thought about. So whether that's surveys or emails or internal messaging or review sites or whatever it might be, it represents a fantastic source of insight, but it's messy and it's difficult to analyze and all these things. And so what we do is make that fast and easy, and I'm sure we'll come on to how we do that. We primarily get used now for customer experience, employee engagement, and consumer insight purposes. However, as you point out, that's not how we started. Originally, this was a law enforcement research project. So this was a collaboration between academia in the UK and government agencies in the UK to uncover people masquerading online. And specifically, we did a lot of child protection work. So we know if you're a 13-year-old girl or if you're a 40-year-old man doing a very good impression of a 13-year-old girl. So that was the problem we were designed to solve. And from a data point of view, it's quite a difficult thing to do because unfortunately the bad guys are extremely good at being bad guys. So they will sound 97% the same as a genuine 13-year-old girl. So the problem that causes is that if you took suspect language and you gave that to a conventional text analytics system, it would tell you it's a 13-year-old girl because they're so good at it. Mm-hmm. So obviously that's not the result we want. And so we were commissioned to sort of try and solve this problem. And the way we solved it is through comparison. And this runs to this day through everything we do. So rather than analyzing language in isolation, what we did was that we would take databases of verified, genuine 13-year-old girl language, which we would get from law enforcement. We would take suspect language, and what you do is compare them. Because the bad guys are good, but they're 97% perfect, or 98, or 95% perfect. They're not 100%. Mm-hmm. So what you want to do is compare them, and our system isolates the 5% difference. And it's the differences in language that actually matter. And it's the differences that would end up catching people. So this comparison approach and the isolation of differences runs through everything we do. And so that was the original methodology for law enforcement. And then it was a long and winding road, but it turns out that anyone involved in trying to engage with consumers or understand audiences or understand how how their brand talks compared to a competitor, for example, would find this useful. And so we've ended up now with a business which does this almost exclusively in the commercial world.
Wow, that's so interesting. It's interesting how you shifted. How long did it take to shift into this and get this side of it working perfectly?
Yeah, I mean, it took the migration. I don't know, it's probably a couple of years. I mean, I've got to say that the stuff that was hard, the technology was easy. The hard bit was trying to understand this sort of new world, because as a relatively new sort of technology company, we did everything wrong, right? So no investor would ever advocate you sort of developing something and then thinking, well, how are we going to make money out of this? What are we going to do? Marketing, that sounds exciting. Let's go and learn the marketing industry. However, that is what we ended up doing. It was the learning of the economics of the industry and what people actually cared about, why they cared about it. That was the hard bit, actually. So we did that, for about a year off our own steam, and then our chairman joined, who founded a big media agency, PhD Media, a guy called David Patterson, which is now part of Omnicom. And he was kind of fantastic in helping us understand the agency world and how to talk about what we do, and then what brands really care about, and so on and so on. So, yeah, that was the toughest bit. Tech's easy compared with understanding the landscape.
And so, now that you're in that space, what kind of problems do you solve for them?
Sure. So, what we solve, I mean, there's probably two ways to think about what we do. One is we solve kind of known problems for customers. So they really want to sort of understand how consumers talk about a specific topic. They might have a whole load of text data supporting that. So that might be social, or it might be, say, surveys with open ends. And we get contacted to see what we can do about analyzing this stuff quicker. But then what normally happens is that the comparison approach that we run reveals all kinds of new ways they can reanalyze this data in a comparative manner, which leads them to start thinking differently about how they gather data, what they can do with the language data they've acquired, and so on and so on. So, but to give you an idea, the classics, when we got into this, one of the first great ones we did was in the world of cosmetics. So I'll give you an example. So if you go in the States and you take the aggregated reviews of cosmetics by 20-year-olds, and then the aggregated reviews of cosmetics by 50-year-olds, and so you got millions of words by those two groups, and then you compare them, that gets quite interesting. So 85% of that language is exactly the same, which is kind of what you would expect. But it's the 15% differences are the key stuff. So what you find are things like 20-year-olds will tend to say they wear makeup, and 50-year-olds will tend to say they apply makeup. Mm-hmm. Now, that sounds almost trivial. However, if you're trying to engage with an audience, and you're trying to engage with 20-year-olds, say, and you're saying apply our product every day, you're getting it wrong and you didn't even know it. Yeah. Right? And the thing about comparison is it's a discovery mechanism. Whereas so many sort of big data techniques tend to be search driven. Mm-hmm. So I've had an idea, so I'm going to search for evidence of my idea in the data. And hey presto, I've found it. But the problem with doing that is that if you've got enough data, you'll find evidence of anything. Whereas if you think about where and apply, nobody thought to search for the word where or search for the word apply. Mm. So by comparing two things, you discover these differences. Yeah. And hey presto, if you change your ad to say where, it worked better. Mm. Similarly, Apple's poster campaigns, it says shot on iPhone. It doesn't say taken on iPhone, and that's very deliberate. Because if you own a DSLR camera, you're statistically speaking much more likely to say you shoot images, whereas everyone else says they take pictures.
Interesting.
So comparison then, once you've got your language, which could be anything, you can compare it in lots of different ways. So it could be one age group versus another age group, or it could be the same patient group forum pre-COVID compared with post-COVID. Right?
That would be really interesting to everyone, yes.
Yeah, so like what's the difference in what they're talking about, or the differences in their concerns, or how they talk about their medication, or whatever it might be. It's the differences that matter, right? So it could be time, it could be how they talk about one brand compared to another brand. It could be how one geography talks about a subject compared to another geography, and so on and so on and so on.
Wow, that's amazing. And so what would be the most common specific challenges that companies bring to you?
Yes, so certainly in the pharma world, the comparisons get really interesting, but a lot of it is about how the different stakeholders talk, and how they talk differently about exactly the same thing. So for example, like how do HCPs talk about a condition compared to how the patients talk about a condition? Because you'll find that patients will use either different adjectives or verbs, or will emphasize certain things more than HCPs, and vice versa. And this is an important thing to understand, because you can get language going like this, where you think you're saying the right thing and engaging with an audience, but you're not. Similarly, how the pharma company talks about their product or their service or a condition compared with the HCPs, or compared with the patient group. Again, you see some pretty stunning differences that people never knew existed in this sort of stuff. So those are kind of like the first ones, the classic ones.
Would the client be the market research agencies or the pharma companies themselves in those situations?
It's both. So from a client point of view, the pharma. We have Merck, we have GSK directly, but then on the agency side, we have Havas Links, we have Camellia, which is part of Omnicom, on the agency side, and others as well. So it happens both at agency and brand level directly.
Yeah, wow, it's very interesting, because we did a project for a rare condition where we were using face recognition, actually bots, to identify the patients and send them to a Google ad with retargeting. But what I discovered in that, but I think it would have been even more powerful with your tool, is that the parents of the patients were talking about one thing, and the doctors and the pharma were talking about something completely else, and they hadn't picked up. So it was a genetic condition, and the parents didn't notice that the child had it until they had an inability to potty train. And that was not in any of the clinical trial data, because obviously it wasn't of interest to pharma or doctors. But that's how we found our patients, because we went into the Facebook group of the diagnosed parents who were talking, and they were talking about that more than anything else. So we were like, okay, that's what we've got to focus on. And that's how we found all the patients, because we focused on what they said. But I'm sure that if we had had this kind of stuff you're doing on top of that, that would have been amazing.
That's a classic. There's a couple of things that spring to mind. We've done, if you look at the difference between people with, heart conditions, with let's say they've got heart disease, how do they talk about their condition compared with people who have heart disease and diabetes?
Yeah.
It's really different. Like, what they care about is really different. We've also seen, even within the same conditions, so for example, some studies around HIV, depending on age group, older people sort of living with HIV are much more community engaged, right? So you engage the community, you engage those people. Younger people are far less engaged from a community point of view, in HIV. So by just comparing things and understanding the differences in how they talk about things, it becomes so obvious on like how you need to communicate, what you need to say, maybe the channels you use, how you position your brand against others, and so on and so on. Yeah,
that's a really interesting one, because in fact my very first area that I worked in pharmaceuticals was HIV. Right. And in those days it was a death sentence. You know, we only had AZT, that was the first drug out. Yeah. And it was, so I guess nowadays when people get it, it's more of a chronic condition rather than a death sentence. So I think in those days it was more a community, because there was that stigma, and there was...
That's exactly right. Yeah, exactly right.
Wow, that's really interesting. Yeah, that would make a big difference depending on your age too, the way you perceived it.
It's exactly right, yeah. So yeah, that's another classic comparison, you know, age within a condition.
Yeah. So what would be your favorite kind of projects that you get from healthcare clients?
I think mainly from a technical, I mean, this is probably more my, rather than being a farmer, you know, a farmer-driven reason. Yeah. It's like a tech-driven reason. I think the ones I love are where we liberate data they've already got.
Yeah.
So I think the classic here is sort of surveys and IDEs, where they'll come to us and they have a survey. So, you know, standard survey, tick box 1 to 5 type stuff, and then there's open ends. And this is one of the things that blew me away when I was sort of learning the industry, actually, when we were coming out of law enforcement, was the amount of money people get charged in order to kind of traditionally code and analyze open-end surveys. Just melts my brain. It's just ridiculous. And because it's so expensive and time-consuming, people weren't including open ends. That's actually one of the fundamental reasons why open ends aren't in a lot of surveys. It's not because people don't think open ends are valuable. They actually think they're really valuable. Just that it's so expensive to process. So what would happen was we would like get a big survey upload, so the data uploads into Relative Insight, and then what we can do is split the open end responses by the metadata. So you have a bunch of open ends from certain age groups, or from genders, or from geographies, or whatever it might be. And you can take this data you've got and you can compare how, say, one age group responds compared to another age group, and what are the differences in their concerns. Or people who rated you 5-star compared with 4-star. The language tells you why you have the difference between 5-star and 4-star. And so my favorite exercises are when people bring us in just initially to say, help us process this language, and then what we can do is bring this language to life in way more ways than they ever thought by doing the right comparisons. And then what you normally find is, well, if you can do that for this survey that we've just done, we've got this cabinet full of surveys that we've been doing for 10 years, which is just sat there and we're doing nothing with it. And so often, I think when vendors come into this space, it's normally use our stuff to get more data. And what we find is that more data quite often isn't the problem. The problem is like efficient, effective analysis of all the data you're accumulating right now.
Absolutely.
So the ones I like the best are when we can go in for what initially seems like quite a simplistic approach, and then we reveal all this extra value from that survey. Not only that, and then we can get into all the other stuff they've got. And then all of a sudden, all this language data that our customers have got becomes a strategic asset, which they can start using in all kinds of ways.
I think that's really interesting, because the data is really the strategic advantage, because anyone can do the high-speed computing, almost anyone can do the algorithms now, but the data is really, and so you being able to liberate the data they have. So, you know, a lot of pharma companies buy the same data, whereas if they're using all the data from their call centers and from all of the research they've done and, you know, their CRM systems, etc., that language data would be so powerful and unique to them to give them that competitive advantage.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, not just in pharma, but I think the industry in general, I think there's going to be a big push towards more first-party data.
Yeah.
And so in more, B2C consumer type FMCG world, that you've got walled gardens like Facebook, you've got third-party audience targeting like cookie-based stuff, and then you've got first-party. And the middle one of those, cookie world, third-party audiences, that's crumbling and that's going to disintegrate because of technological changes which are coming and privacy concerns and all kinds of stuff, which is going to kind of leave you with like pile in the first-party world, into walled garden world like Facebook, but no one really wants to throw all their eggs into that basket.
No.
So I think what you're going to see then is quite a lot of effort and budget put into really developing and getting way more strategic value out of first-party data sources.
Totally agree.
And the tools are already out there. The data, obviously, everyone knows is already out there. It's just being, coming up with a way to engage with that data, which it doesn't involve APIs and masses of consultants and, long drawn-out projects like that.
Yeah.
The tools are there to really get great value out of that stuff. So I think we're seeing a lot of that going to happen.
That's great. And I guess you can combine all that different data together, can't you?
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, having different perspectives on these research questions for the pharma industry from different sources of data. So surveys or, which obviously is kind of first party and gathered and a little bit directed. Transcripts of focus groups, IDEs, things like that. And then you've got this, all this other sort of language out there in patient forums and things like that, which gives you another raft of perspectives and way people talk. So you can, language brings all these perspectives together so you can validate, check, really make sure that your path to action is validated.
That's nice. And I've got two questions that spring to mind. The first is about GDPR and the second is about languages. Maybe I'll start with languages because it's probably easier.
Yeah,
so
sure.
I assume that obviously your biggest market would be English. Have you ventured into any other languages as yet?
Yeah, so you're right. The biggest market for us is UK and the USA, and obviously English is the dominant language there. We do support other languages on a sort of more limited basis. So most of the sort of European heritage, so French, German, Spanish, Portuguese, that type of stuff. What
about Japanese and Chinese? Because a lot of our clients are in Japan specifically, but more and more in China. So I'm just wondering about those two languages. They're probably a little bit harder, but would you need to customize for a client?
So we don't support those off the shelf. I mean, I won't bore you with the technicalities, but what we do is basically codify a language. And that's hard. And Japanese and Chinese are hard to do that in. Having said that, the insights customers get out of our platform, sometimes it's trend and sort of general themes, and then sometimes it's these sort of highly specific word changes. Having said all that, we've had actually quite a lot of success in the thematic analysis by running, we've done several projects in Japanese where we've run Japanese through auto-translate into English, then you do the analysis in English.
And then back.
And that will give you the thematics pretty well. I wouldn't necessarily use it for this, like the specific word interpretation. I think that's too much.
Yeah.
But the Asian languages are on the roadmap to develop as well.
Oh, good.
So we are working on it.
Oh, good. That'll be good for them. They'll be very happy to hear that. And then what about privacy? I get asked all the time, how do you do this with GDPR? Have you had any challenges in that space?
No, we haven't really. And the reason is, so we're an analytics layer.
Mm-hmm.
We're not a data acquirer.
Sure.
Okay? So by the time we're analyzing data, it's the hygiene factor is really, really good. So we're either analyzing first-party data, which the pharma company or the agency has, in which case, it's already gone through GDPR compliance. or we're analyzing third-party data, which is kind of being accessed, which is either it's anonymized already, you can't, there's no way you can tell, who's who, and it's normally always aggregated.
Yeah.
And the third-party stuff is normally always accessed via another service. So, for example, if the customer is analyzing Twitter data, they've normally gathered that because they'll have a social media listening platform, which might have some basic word cloud sentiment analysis in it. But they'll gather Twitter data using that tool and then export that data into Relative Insight.
Okay.
So by the time it gets to us, normally there's no GDPR issues. But having said all that, we're ISO accredited and we take privacy very seriously and all those things.
Okay, interesting. Well, that's good to know. What about if someone wanted to use this? What would be the steps? How long would it take for them to? So they say yes, we want to do it now, and they give you the data. How long after that does it take to kind of do these kind of analyses?
Oh, I mean okay. So once we've got the data and we know what we're comparing, I mean that's minutes, literally minutes.
Say you had a very big market research project with gazillions of open-ended questions. How long would that take to analyze?
Yeah, so I suppose there's maybe 3 components to getting value out of Relative Insight. So step 1 is what do you kind of want to know and what's your project, and defining that, and targeting and assessing the data.
Yeah.
So what data are you going to use? Is it IDE transcripts? Is it surveys? Is it what format is the survey in? And then we need to get it uploaded into the platform. So that's kind of step 1. And we have lots of automated ways to get almost any type of language data into the platform ready for analysis. And almost everything that gets uploaded preserves the metadata as well.
Okay.
So that's sort of the first part. The second part is the sort of upload, the processing, and then the comparison. And that takes a trip, obviously that's the cleverest part, but that takes a trivial amount of time because we're a technology platform.
Sure.
And then the third part is analyzing the differences. Mm-hmm. So our output are what are the key linguistic differences between 2 sets of language. Mm-hmm. Now, that needs to be analyzed by someone, there's probably 2 sets of knowledge maybe needed there. One is domain expertise. So we're dominantly used by analysts who are already familiar with other sort of analytic tools. Mm-hmm. I mean, conceptually, we're pretty simple. It's upload 2 things, compare them, look at what the difference is. So, but domain expertise is needed to sort of, let's look at the differences in, say, semantic concepts. Some things will jump out to a domain expert that a non-domain expert wouldn't know. Mm-hmm. And sometimes there's linguistic differences that we can help out with. So is it first person or third person, or is there a difference in tense, which we know normally indicates something, or is there emotional differences, things like this. So then you can sort of see all these differences, and then what happens is that within the tool you then pick out these critical insights, and then you build visuals for export. So rather than the output being, a bunch of noughts and ones, I'm exaggerating, but very technical kind of output, you get, nicely summarized, visualized conclusions, which you can organize together, for whatever audience you want to put it to. So those are the steps. Mm-hmm. The technology takes minutes. The stuff which takes longer is kind of organizing the data and then doing the analysis, but it's still quick. I mean, days.
So if you had days, that's brilliant. And so for a whole project, that's amazing. So if you had a client that was a market research agency that you'd worked with, and they came back to you with the same kind of data, would that be even faster for you? The more projects they did with you, the faster it would become?
No. So the way the system works, mm-hmm. I think what you're alluding to is does our system learn the language? It doesn't actually work like that. So
okay.
No, everything's just as fast. The only thing which changes the processing rate is just the volume of language you upload.
Okay.
But having said that, we'll process millions of words in, 10 minutes or 20 minutes. And to put that in perspective, giving some of my favorite language facts, the average novel is 160,000 words. If you took, my standard millennial reference is Harry Potter. So if you took every Harry Potter book end to end, that's 1 million words.
Okay.
And we're regularly doing data sets in the sort of tens of millions.
Wow, that's amazing. And that's the whole project is a few days.
Yeah, absolutely. And the great thing about language is that I should also point out, you don't need tens of millions of words of data to get results. We also do, comparisons on as few as 1,000 words compared to each other can give you some really interesting, really important insights as well.
Yeah. So big or small projects, it works for all of them and very quickly.
Yeah, absolutely right. It's kind of like the amount of data is not, we don't really either price or think about projects in terms of the amount of data. We normally think much more in terms of projects and number of comparisons that you want to do. That's the key thing. To get the value is to think about the comparisons you want to do.
Okay, so that's good advice for someone coming to you is before they come to you, think about what data they've got and what comparisons they're looking for.
Yeah, and I think, and I'd extend that to, even if they're not coming to talk to us and they're just thinking about, language analytics in general. I think we've all been on the wrong end of a PowerPoint deck, which has a word cloud somewhere in it, and sentiment analysis. And, it's really, I think a lot of it is just to think through, is that really going to be interesting? Just because, you have Neurofem, for example, off the top of my head. Let's do a word cloud of how people talk about Neurofem.
Yeah.
Well, it'll say Nurofen, and it'll say pain, and it'll say relief, and it'll say headache, and it'll say, joint, and it'll say that stuff. But that doesn't mean that's how people talk about Nurofen.
No.
Because you could do exactly the same thing for ibuprofen, and I guarantee the word cloud would be exactly the same.
Yeah.
And the only difference is the word, Nurofen or ibuprofen. So it's only by thinking through, or it might not. But what is the difference? And that's why you've got to compare stuff.
Yeah.
So what are the differences in how people talk about ibuprofen compared to how they talk about Nurofen?
Yeah.
What are the subtleties? So I think when you think about all the language you've got, that's the thing to think through. Don't fall into the trap of sort of confirmation bias and throwing off a word cloud and that sort of thing.
Yeah. And then once they come to you, you have a subscription model, I understand?
Yeah, so there's easy ways to get engaged with us. The product is normally sold on a subscription basis, but we've got easy ways to start off. We've got extensive account management as well. We just don't throw you the technology and say, hey, good luck. We help you through projects all the way, and we can engage at sort of various different levels for various different lengths, depending on the type of projects that you want to do.
Amazing. Well, I think this would be so useful to anyone, particularly in market research or marketing, because it just will give so many more insights to the data they've got, and they can do a lot more open-ended than they would have done in the past, because it can be analyzed quickly. And
the goal is in open-end. It doesn't have to be painful.
That might be your strapline.
Yeah.
So, wow. Okay. Well, thank you so much. I've just found this so fascinating. I just think it's just where everything will end up with language analysis, because this is what there is, and particularly now that so much language is online that's there to be collected, this is going to be even more powerful.
Yeah, I think it's growing exponentially, and I think, on the medicine side, that's one final thing, thinking about the medical world with the rise of online consultations, events and congresses going online. It means that there's going to be way more potentially transcribed language data, which maybe wasn't democratized or accessible before. I think the current crisis is kind of revealing some even more ways we can use language to improve insights.
I love that example you gave about how patients discuss their conditions pre and post COVID, because I think that's also a big challenge that pharma are having at the moment is, how to engage their patients right now and the doctors, because there's so much digital noise, and getting the right language is one of the keys to getting engagement. If you pick the thing that's interesting them, then they're going to get more attention to that.
Yeah, exactly right. And particularly with COVID, the sort of societal discussion is changing quite quick, and it's the small things you need to pick up. So I'll maybe leave you with probably my favorite language anecdote. So one of the reasons we're so obsessed with comparison is that I think in the English language there's like 171,000 words. But if you read a magazine or a newspaper or transcripts of a conference, or you look at the words we've used in this discussion, 50% of the individual words we've used, are made up of just 170 individual words.
Wow.
So at least half of what we say is just sort of blah, 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 building blocks of language, which means the rest of it that's the interesting stuff. And we've done COVID analysis in other areas, and it's the subtle differences you can see will end up changing attitudes, behaviors. And it's just going to keep going.
It will. Well, thank you so much for your time today. I've thoroughly enjoyed it, and hopefully we'll hear more from you in the future.
I appreciate you asking me on. It's great to talk. Thanks a lot.
Likewise. Thank you so much.